I want to tell you about the night I got married. Not the ceremony itself. Not the food or the hundreds of guests or the blue dress I had sewn myself over 3 months, or the German hymns that carried through most of the afternoon. I want to tell you about what happened after all of that was finished. After the last guest had gone home and the last dish had been washed, and my mother had pressed my hands between hers and looked at me with an expression I did not have words for, and walked out the door. I want to tell you about the first moment I was alone with the man I had just married. His name was Eli. He was 25 years old. I was 18. We had met, if that word even applies, at a church gathering 7 months earlier when his family relocated to our district from Ohio. I had spoken to him perhaps 6 times before our wedding day. Never alone. Always in the presence of family. Always inside the context of community. Always with the understanding that what was being arranged between our families was not quite the same thing as what develops between two people who are choosing each other, because nothing was developing between two people. There was no courtship in the way that word is understood outside. There was no gradual knowing. There was an arrangement and a ceremony, and then a small house on his family's land, and a door that closed behind us, and the sound of the last buggy pulling away down the road. And then there was silence. I had been told I was prepared for that moment. My mother had given me what she considered necessary information in 3 sentences 2 weeks before the wedding in the kitchen after supper. My aunt had told me to be obedient and not to cry. A woman from the church had squeezed my arm and said, "It gets easier." Not one of them had told me what to do with the silence. Eli sat down in the chair by the window. I stood near the door, still in my wedding dress, still wearing the cap I had put on that morning before sunrise. The lamp on the table made the room amber and small. Outside I could hear the last of the wind moving through the corn. He did not look at me for a long moment. He looked at his hands. He was, I understood even then, also nervous. Whatever image people carry of Amish husbands, confident and settled in their authority, Eli was 25 years old and also sitting in a room with a stranger he had just promised his life to. Whatever he had been told to expect, he was meeting the reality of it for the first time, the same as I was. He looked up. He looked at me. Really looked, the way you look at someone when the ceremony is finally over and the guests are finally gone, and what remains is just the two of you and the truth of what has been agreed to. And then he said 4 words. 4 words, that was all. I am not going to tell you yet what they were. I want you to stay with me through this story, because those 4 words only carry their full weight if you understand what came before them and what came after. What I will say is this. They were not cruel words. They were not romantic words. They were not the words of a man trying to frighten me or establish dominance or perform a role. They were the words of a man who had been handed a set of rules, a set of responsibilities, and a wife he did not know, and who was doing the only thing available to him in a situation neither of them had been equipped to navigate. They were honest words. And that honesty, which I am only old enough and far enough away to fully see now, was the most complicated thing about them. I had been raised in a world where honesty between a husband and wife was considered less important than obedience, less important than order, less important than the appearance of a marriage that functioned correctly from the outside. And Eli, without knowing what he was doing, had walked right past all of that on our very first night. The first year of our marriage was the year I learned that Eli was a good man. I want to say that plainly, because everything that comes later in this story requires you to understand it. He was not cruel. He was not cold. He was not the kind of husband whose name women say with bitterness decades on. He was, and this is the most honest word I have for him, limited. Limited by what he had been taught, limited by what he had been shown, limited by a world that had handed him authority without teaching him what to do with it, and a wife without teaching him how to see her. He worked hard. He was honest in his dealings with everyone in the community. He was respected. He fixed what broke and paid what he owed, and showed up when neighbors needed him. By every measure our world used to evaluate a husband, Eli was a good one. But there is a kind of loneliness that lives inside a good marriage to a limited man. It is a particular kind because you cannot point to anything specific that is wrong. You cannot say he did this or he said that. You can only say something that sounds small until you've spent years inside it. I am not seen. Not ignored. Not dismissed. Not disrespected even. Just not seen. Eli looked at me every day of our marriage. He spoke to me, ate the food I made, slept in the bed I kept, brought home what the farm produced and handed it over to be managed. He was present in every practical sense. But he did not know what I was thinking. He did not know what I was afraid of. He did not know what I read at night when I was the last one awake, or what I noticed on Sunday morning sitting in the Gmail, or what questions I had been holding inside me for years without ever being given room to ask them. He did not know because he had never asked, and he had never asked because it had not occurred to him that a wife's interior life was something a husband was meant to be curious about. I want to be careful to say this was not unique to Eli. I have spoken with enough women of my generation, Amish and English alike, to know that this particular form of invisibility was common. It was not a flaw in Eli as an individual. It was a flaw woven into the entire architecture of how men and women were taught to be with each other. Women were taught to be useful. Men were taught to be capable. And somewhere between useful and capable, the question of whether two people actually knew each other, the way you know someone when you have allowed them to see you in the dark, was simply never asked. I had 3 children in the first 5 years of our marriage, 3 pregnancies, 3 deliveries, all at home, all without what anyone outside would consider adequate preparation or support, and 3 newborns layered onto the continuous labor of a household that does not pause for recovery. I was not unhappy, exactly. I was too busy to be unhappy. Unhappiness requires a certain amount of time to sit with itself, and in those early years, time alone was something I almost never had. But I remember with the particular clarity that only the most significant moments carry. A Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd year of our marriage when all 3 children were somehow simultaneously asleep. The house was quiet, in a way it almost never was. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and turned the kitchen golden, and I sat down at the table and put my hands in my lap and simply sat there. I did not pray. I did not plan. I did not reach for the next task on the list. I sat in the quiet and listened to myself breathe, and I thought, I do not know what I want. Not because I have no wants, because I have never once been asked. Eli came in from the barn about 20 minutes later. He looked at me sitting there, hands in my lap, nothing in front of me, no visible task. I could see the small confusion on his face. Not criticism, just confusion. A wife sitting at a table doing nothing was outside the frame of what made sense to him. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," I said. "I was just thinking." He nodded. He poured himself some water. He went back outside. He did not ask what I was thinking about. He never did. There is a thing that happens to women who are not seen for long enough. It is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive on a particular day attached to a particular event. It arrives the way fog arrives, slowly and without edges, until one morning you look up and you cannot make out the shape of yourself anymore. I was 29 when I noticed it. 29 years old, 11 years married, 5 children, a house and a farm and a community and a husband, and a life that was by every visible measure full. And I looked into the small mirror above the wash basin one morning, not to study myself, the way women sometimes look when they are checking something, and I did not recognize the expression on my face. Not the face itself. The expression. The particular quality of the eyes. They were flat in a way I did not remember them being. Not sad, just absent. like a lamp that has been turned down so gradually that you did not notice the room dimming until the day you needed the light and found it had almost gone out. I want to say this carefully, because I know there are women who will recognize what I am describing without needing any clinical language for it. And I know there are others who have not thought about their own lives in these terms, who have perhaps always assumed that the flatness, if they noticed it at all, was simply what growing older felt like, what being a wife and mother felt like, what responsibility and hard work and the passage of time feel like. It is not. Tiredness feels like tiredness. Age feels like age. What I'm describing is something else entirely. It is what happens when a person, a fully formed, thinking, feeling, curious, intelligent person, spends enough years having none of those qualities reflected back to her. When the world around her responds only to her function and never to herself. When the question of what she is thinking is never asked, not because no one cares, but because no one has been taught that it is a question worth asking. It is a particular kind of disappearing, and it happens slowly enough that by the time you notice it, you have already been gone for a while. Eli was not cruel to me. I cannot say that enough. He did not prevent me from speaking. He did not punish me for having thoughts. He simply did not follow them, did not step toward them when they were visible, did not build a space where they were welcome, and a thought that is never welcomed over enough years learns not to arrive. There was a woman in our community named Sister Clara. She was in her 60s, a widow, and she had the kind of reputation that belongs to someone who has seen difficult things and moved through them without becoming bitter, which in our community was a high form of praise. I had always been a little afraid of her, the way you are sometimes afraid of people whose clarity you sense but cannot yet name. She came to help when my youngest was born and stayed 3 days. On the last afternoon, when the baby was sleeping and the older children were outside and Eli was in the fields and the house had gone as quiet as it ever got, she sat across the table from me and looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "You have gone somewhere, Rebecca." I looked up. "Not away," she said. "Inward. Too far inward. That is its own kind of leaving." I did not know what to say. I was 31 years old and barely 50 words into the most honest conversation anyone had ever had with me. "What do you do?" I said, and I am not sure I had planned to ask it. It simply arrived, "When no one asks." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You start asking yourself, out loud if you have to, in a journal, in the dark, somewhere. Because the thoughts do not vanish when you stop voicing them. They go underground, and underground thoughts grow strange." She stood, put on her coat, and left. I sat at that table for a very long time after she went. I thought about Eli. About 11 years of marriage, about 5 children and 1 farm and a community, and a life full of everything, except the one thing Sister Clara had named. The asking. I thought about the 4 words, the ones Eli had said on our first night in the lamplight in the small room after the last guests had gone. I was beginning to understand them differently now, beginning to understand what they had been telling me all along, not just about Eli, but about the entire shape of the life I had agreed to. I got up. I found a pencil. I found a piece of paper, and for the first time in 31 years, I asked myself a question and wrote the answer down. That piece of paper still exists. I have it still. It was the first sentence of a very long conversation I have been having with myself ever since. The paper said 4 words. I know how that sounds, too neat to be true. But I did not plan it. I simply wrote down the answer to the question I had asked myself, which was, "What do you actually want?" And the answer that came out, without deliberation, without editing, was 4 words long. I will not tell you what they were yet. That comes at the end, where it belongs. What I will tell you is what happened in the months after I wrote them down. I did not show Eli the paper. I did not show anyone. I folded it and placed it in the bottom of the trunk where I kept the few things that were entirely mine. A book my grandmother had given me, a small photograph, the hair from each of my children's first haircuts, the private archive of a life that had been almost entirely public. But something had shifted. The way things shift when you finally put language to something that has been formless inside you. The life was the same. Eli was the same. The days were the same. But I had named something. And naming changes the relationship between a person and the thing they have named. I could see it now in a way I had not been able to before. I started to speak more. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have alarmed Eli or the community or my own sense of what was safe. Just more. When I had a thought at supper, I said it. When someone said something I disagreed with at a community gathering, I said quietly, "I am not sure that is quite right." When my oldest daughter, who was 12, came to me with a question about her own life, I told her the truth instead of the acceptable answer. Small things, invisible things, from the outside, mostly. But Eli noticed. He did not say anything at first. He was not that kind of man, quick to name what he observed and address it directly. He went quiet in the way he sometimes did, which I had learned over 13 years to read as processing rather than disapproval. He was taking the measure of something. The conversation happened on a Saturday evening in March, after the children were in bed. We were at the kitchen table, as all important things in an Amish life seem to happen at the kitchen table. Eli was mending a piece of harness. I was reading. The fire was low, and the house was quiet. He set the harness down. He looked at me. "You are different lately," he said. I set the book down. "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is it something I have done?" And here is the thing about Eli. Here is what I want you to understand about a man who is limited but not cruel, who is shaped by his world but not beyond reach, who has spent 13 years not asking but is capable, in a quiet moment, of asking one honest question. He was not defensive. He was not angry. He was, and I say this with the full weight of what it must have cost him to be this, genuinely asking. I thought about his 4 words from our first night. I thought about my 4 words on the piece of paper in the trunk. I thought about Sister Clara and underground thoughts growing strange. And I said, simply, without drama, the way you say something when you have been unknowingly preparing to say it for 3 years. Eli, you have never asked me what I think about anything. He was very still. About the farm, I said. About the children. About faith. About our life. You have never once asked me what I think. The fire popped. The clock on the wall moved. He looked at his hands. He looked at the harness. He looked at me. And then he said something I had not expected, something that in 40 years of turning this conversation over I have come to understand was the best thing Eli ever did. Not because it fixed everything, because it did not. Not because it changed us overnight, because it did not. But because it was honest. And in a world that had handed both of us so many scripts to follow, one honest thing was more than I had been given on the night we married. He said, "I did not know I was supposed to." 6 words, that time. We were improving. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. And for the first time, in 13 years of marriage, my husband and I began, slowly and imperfectly, and too late, and not too late, to actually meet each other. And now I will tell you the 4 words Eli said on our wedding night, because you have stayed with me, and you have earned them. Eli sat in the chair by the window. The lamp made the room small and amber. The last buggy had gone down the road. I was standing near the door in my wedding dress, and there was nothing between us anymore. No guests, no ceremony, no family, no community structure to stand inside of, no role to perform. Just two strangers who had just promised their lives to each other in a language neither of them had chosen. He looked up at me, and he said, "I will try hard." That was it. 4 words. I will try hard. Not, I love you. Not you are beautiful. Not I am so glad it is you. Not any of the things that even inside an Amish world a girl in a wedding dress on the first night of her marriage might have allowed herself to hope for. I will try hard. I stood there and looked at him, and I did not know what to say. I was 18 years old. I did not have the language yet to understand what those words meant. I filed them away the way you file things you do not yet have the tools to open. And I went about the business of that night, and the days that followed, and the years that accumulated after. But I never forgot them. Here is what I know now at 68 that I could not know at 18. Those 4 words were the most honest thing Eli could have said to me in that moment. They were the unscripted truth of a man who had been handed a life he did not know how to live, telling me in the only way available to him that he understood the weight of it. He was not promising me love. He was not promising me happiness. He was not promising any of the things that, had we been different people in a different world, might have been the right promises to make. He was promising effort. He was promising presence. He was promising that whatever came, he would not turn away from it without trying. It was not enough. I want to be honest about that. It was not enough to fill the years of not being asked, not being seen, not being known. It was not enough to make up for the silence that stretched between us across 13 years of kitchen tables. It was not enough to return to me the questions I had never been allowed to ask, or the self I had spent so long disappearing into. But it was real. And real, in a world built on performance and carefully maintained appearances, was something. Eli died 11 years ago. We had been together 32 years by then. We had found each other eventually, the way some people find each other after it is almost too late, imperfectly, incompletely, with too much already spent. But we found each other. At his graveside, one of our daughters asked me, "Did you love him, Mama?" And I thought about those 4 words, about a 25-year-old man in a lamplight room looking at a stranger he had promised his life to, and saying the most honest thing he knew how to say. I told her, he tried hard, and so did I. And in the end, that turned out to be its own kind of love. I am 68 years old. I have been telling this story for a long time, first to myself, then to my children, and now to you. I tell it not because it is a love story in the way people expect love stories to be shaped. I tell it because it is a true story. And true stories, the ones that refuse to clean themselves up, the ones that stay complicated all the way to the end, are the only ones worth the telling. If these words reached something in you today, pass them to someone who needs to know that their own complicated story is worth telling too. And if you have 4 words you have never forgotten, words someone said to you in an important room on an important night, leave them somewhere they can be heard. You do not have to explain them. Sometimes 4 words are enough to carry a whole life inside them.